So it is now my privilege to introduce our next panel. And I'm so pleased to introduce the CEO, Rashad Bajwa of Domain Technology, who's also an NJBIA board member. I'm so excited because I get his sage advice all the time around my board table. Thank you for that, Rashad. But Rashad is an amazing leader in his community as well. Rashad's going to introduce himself and the panel, and they're going to be discussing the topic of the inclusion piece of D&I, cultivating inclusive culture. Rashad, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Michelle, so much for that intro. So hello and welcome to the inclusion piece of D&I, specifically how we can cultivate an inclusive culture, brought to you by New Jersey's Clean Energy Program. So as Michelle mentioned, my name is Rashad Bajwa. I'm CEO of Domain Technology Partners, and I'm excited to have the privilege of kicking this panel off. So thank you all for being with us. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. For the maximum benefit of the discussion, I encourage you to change your screen view from gallery to speaker. If you're not sure how, you can just ping someone in the chat and they'll show you how to do it. Complete bios for the panelists can be found in the speaker section on the events webpage. And there will also be time set aside for questions at the end of the panel discussion. So we're starting here at 12:15 and roughly, we're gonna go until 1:15 and about 1 o'clock, I'll get the conversation shifted towards Q&A. So a couple of things here. There's also we're recording the session. So if anything happens with your technology, just know we're gonna have it recorded. So not to be too concerned. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the panel. And as I call your names, if you would, please take about 30 seconds to introduce yourselves, a little bit of your background, and then we'll get into the conversation. So first, Janine Johnson, Enterprise Manager for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion with PSC&G. Janine.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be with you and to share, and also with my colleagues that are on, who will introduce themselves. I'm a certified diversity professional, been with the utility PSCG for a little over 6 years, and I have the privilege and the honor to focus on strategy development, impacting the utility with respect to how do we create a feeling of inclusivity across the board in all the communities that are not only a part of our workforce, but the customers that we serve. So that's largely my responsibility.
Excellent.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today.
Thank you, Janine. Next, we have Lisa Brooks-Grow, Principal and Founder of Sync Worldwide.
Good afternoon, everyone. And as Janine said, what a pleasure it is to spend part of the afternoon with you. My organization is Sync Worldwide, and we are a human capital consultancy. So we help organizations create HR strategy, more importantly, diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies, as well as talent strategies. And a good bulk of our work has been around executive coaching, but really focusing on diverse leaders and making sure when they make that transition from one role to another, that they do it very successfully, and helping them navigate that corporate jungle. So thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, Lisa. And last, we have Elizabeth, but not least, we have Elizabeth Williams-Riley.
Hello, everyone. I am the president and CEO for DASH Consulting. That stands for Developing Assets for Successful Habits. I am a diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism practitioner, and I work with a number of different organizations and corporations, all different sectors, to look at what it takes to transform an organization to be more inclusive. A part of that includes training and organizational development and assessment, but a specific role that I'm playing now in expanding my business is to work with top executive leaders or anyone responsible for implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion to help them have a better understanding and support to do the work, building their own individual capacity through coaching. You can't train away bigotry. People need to hold space and not be as vulnerable in front of their peers and colleagues, but they can do that with some coaching and be inspired and motivated. So that's what I focus on through my business. I've been in the space for 25 years. I've told people before, I started when I was 2, and that's my story. I'm sticking to it.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for that. So hopefully the rest of you are as excited as me, because this is an area that a lot of folks have a lot of questions about. And so we've been talking about D&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we're going to break this conversation. Specifically, we're focused on inclusion, the inclusion piece right now, but it's hard not to touch on all of them. And to some extent, in order to do that, you have to have definitions. So we're going to cover three main areas. So first, we're going to focus on definitions. Then we're going to talk a little bit about engagement, meaning how you actually roll this out. And then the final piece before we get to Q&A, we're going to talk a little bit about if you're successful, what does it actually look like? Meaning, what does inclusion look like? What does it feel like? How do you measure it? Things along those lines. So with that, let's start off with definitions. So I'm going to pose this out to the group. Please feel free to share a couple of minutes each on this because this is a key one, I think, that frames the rest of the conversation. So specifically, we've been talking about these different terms. Let's talk about the terms. How is inclusion different than diversity? And what about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is now out there as well? Janine, you want to kick us off?
Framework for the discussion. Diversity, think of diversity as the list of invitees that you would put together if you had a phenomenal party, and consider the party as the workplace. So who are the people that you would invite? That would create the diversity, making sure that you include every department. In an organization the size of mine, 13,000 employees, 5 states, I'd want to make sure every department head was included, every region, every business unit. That's where you get the variety, the differences. I'd want to make sure that from the standpoint of ethnicity and representation, that I have an equitable distribution of women and men, that I'm looking at all the different ethnic groups. I'm looking horizontally across leadership, individual development, individual contributors, as well as our union folks. That's where you get all the differences. The inclusion part is once you have everybody in the location, in the room, and you look around, it's like, yep, everybody's been invited. It's the individual experience of asking folks to dance, because party's not a party unless you're actually having fun and engaged in it. And it's that experience of being asked to participate that is the inclusion piece. The equity piece is about access. So in order for you to create your invitee list, the individuals who would want to be there, want to be asked, need to feel like they have access to be on the list. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done to create access. And that's what equity could be considered. So.
Excellent. Thanks, Janine. Elizabeth.
I'll just add to Janine's definition, the idea of diversity being not just about social identities, and that idea of representation goes deeper, because diversity is dimensional. We're not just the who we are. We are the what we've learned, how we live, how we lead, and how we interact. So you want to take a more holistic approach around diversity and not just stay with the social constructs and social identities. I think it's very important to do that. And it is simple in its nature. Diversity is the mix of people. And it's about their stories, their voices, their lived and learned experiences. It's all of those things that make them who they are and how they show up. In terms of equity, it is the idea that people have what they need. They have what they need to thrive and to succeed. It's not just they have what everyone else has, because oftentimes people need a little bit more to have access or to gain access. And that's very important to understand, that having equal things does not make it equitable. And in terms of inclusion, I think that that bigger piece and that bigger picture is how you make the mix work. So it is the actual practice. It's the things that you do. It's not what you are. It's how you do what you do in terms of making sure that people can thrive and succeed. It's the intentional and deliberate things that are in place.
So Lisa, to piggyback on those comments. So number one, I want to get your take on those definitions. But I've heard of the inclusion being asked to dance. So literally in a workplace, what are so first touch on the definitions as you've heard them already. But then what does it look like to be asked to dance, or what does it look like to not be asked to dance?
So great. So my colleagues gave some great definitions and the metaphors, which is beautiful. So I'll piggyback off of that. What it looks like too. So, you know, being invited to the dance, yes, that's one thing. Being asked to dance, and then, you know, having music at the dance that you can actually dance to and that you like, and that appeals to you. So that is the diversity, the equity, or the diversity, inclusion, and equity piece of it. Now, I'm going to take that, I'm going to transport us to the actual workplace. So if I'm feeling, okay, well, I've been invited now, I've been asked to dance, I've been asked to participate, and then my participation or my voice is being heard, I'm feeling valued. If I'm feeling valued in the workplace, well, I'm probably going to bring my best self. I am going to do more than just comply, meaning I'm going to come more than what with that 99.9% or more than 100%. I'm going to give 150%. I'm going to stay until the project gets done, because from that point, I'm feeling valued. And when I feel valued, my voice is being heard, I'm also going to be more productive. So if I'm more productive, I'm going to be more innovative. And when that happens, the organization wins as well. So I'm feeling good. I'm feeling like I'm making a contribution. I'm being heard. And when that happens, you have increased engagement, you have increased productivity, decreased attrition, it decreased people, you know, just not showing up for work. So if you keep following that trail, these are all the benefits to diversity, equity, and inclusion for the individual, but as well as the organization. So if we keep following the trail, I would say keep following the money, you know, we start to see the benefits of it.
That's really powerful.
Definitely true.
Definitely true. There is a business case, a profitable marginal bottom line when we're talking to businesses about equity, diversity, equity, inclusion.
Yeah, and Janine, that is so powerful because, you know, I would love to think, and again, I would love to think in my world that people are going to do this because of their moral imperative and their moral compass. And so I'm going to let me play in my own world for a while. So I'd like to think that people are always going to want to do the right thing. But because I've lived on this planet in this orbit long enough to know that if there's a business case behind it, if that's going to lead to, you know, increased productivity, increased revenue, then, you know, I start to say, okay, well, then there may be another reason why organizations would do this. Yes, the moral imperative, I'm always going to lead with that, but that business case, that competitive advantage, if you're not in tune to diversity, equity, inclusion, you are leaving money on the table.
Leaving money on the table. You're losing your you're losing the top talent in the world.
Yeah.
One of the things,
oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Elizabeth.
One of the things I just wanted to add to this conversation, and I think the metaphor of dancing is so wonderful because it beautifully illustrates how we show up in our spaces. One of the things that we also want to take into consideration is that, just like Lisa said, if I'm dancing to hip hop and you're doing a waltz, there's going to be some problems there in terms of how we perceive each other and our ability to dance. Or, you know, I've been in these dances and not been asked to dance, but I'm comfortable dancing on my own.
Is that okay?
So is there space to really do that? Okay? Is that okay? And can I be okay? And do I not get judged for being alone in that space? So much of definition and giving framework means that you have to be able to evolve in your understanding, and that you have to be open to nuances and things that emerge as a part of your own learning, as a part of your own growth. So it's one thing to give you definitions, but they have to be working for you. And you have to be learning in the process of defining things so that you're not just stuck and you don't evolve.
So before we transition over to engagement and actually executing on this plan, you know, very common, I hear the stories, you know, personal stories, and how those are useful in communicating these definitions, because definitions left by themselves are sometimes a little bit cold and you can't feel them. That's why I think the dancing story is so powerful. What about communicating this to people that have not felt it themselves? What is the power of stories? Should those be used? How can they be used?
Elizabeth, you want to start on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. Stories are very powerful because it shows a sense of ownership. You take on responsibility. And if you're trying to engage in this work and you want to be brave enough and courageous enough, you have to own the intent and the impact. And so if you have lessons learned and you are growing, it's wonderful to pay forward those golden nuggets and to share what you learned. I always say there's stories worth selling. So if you have a great victory or a triumph that you've made in the space, then you should be able to tell that story, and it inspires people, it motivates people, encourages people to align with you. So stories are very powerful. But I have to give an example. Somebody told me a story once about being on an airplane and being delayed and getting upset, and he wanted to just be home, and some people were delayed. They came on, they were celebrities, they were VIPs, and he gave them a dirty look and all this stuff, and he was all upset. And at the end of the day, he sat next to someone else because the person refused to sit next to them. And when he got off the plane, he found out that the person that he was giving all this attitude with was Roberta Flack. And I'm like, okay, you did that? And I said, don't tell anybody else that story, but make sure you tell the lesson you learned from it. So it's one thing to tell stories, but you need to tell the lesson that you learned from it. Sometimes people tell stories and they don't tell the lessons that they learn. And it just reinforces some of the stereotypes and negativity. So the stories are very powerful, but you got to learn and know how to pay forward the lesson learned.
You know, Elizabeth, what you said about telling stories, they are so powerful. And to, talk about the lesson learned. I mean, the other thing that stories do for us is stories humanize us, right? So if you take a story, it humanizes us. It also, it forces us to be vulnerable too. And, and the more we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, people see us in a different light. So by telling stories, we're sharing a part of ourselves. And what that does, it takes us into a different realm and people see us in a different light. And again, that's why stories are so powerful. That's why we see them used, throughout the world, throughout business, throughout education, every place. And that is why they're so powerful, because it takes that antiseptic sort of way we look at things and it humanizes us. It makes us real. It shows us our vulnerabilities and, those areas that perhaps we don't have it all together, but we're open and willing to learn. So stories, again, done well, are so perfect.
Janine, do you use stories in your practice?
All the time, all the time. So let me just give you some context about the utility. PSCG, as I mentioned, is a Fortune 500 company with 13,000 employees. The question is, how do you manage culture change in an environment like that? And the demographics are 80% white male and 75% union, right? And so how do you manage culture change in an environment where that is your demographic? And the most powerful tool in my arsenal is storytelling. And the reason why is because you cannot debate a personal experience. You can debate data points, historical. You can go back and forth and say that's not historically accurate. You can debate statistics and the analysis and the interpretation of it. You can't tell me I didn't experience what I just told you I experienced. And then and so what I've done in telling a story or giving someone voice to their story is to Lisa's point and Elizabeth's point, not only have you humanized them, but you have created a bridge for empathy. Mm-hmm. If you want to change people's behavior, you have to first change their experience. If they don't have an experience that someone coming from a marginalized community, for example, has experienced, then give them yours. And as a result of now hearing your story, oh, I can walk a short distance in your shoes because I know you, individual, employee, coworker, whomever you may be. And then what we do is we move from empathy into a call for action. Now that you can feel what it's like for a moment in my shoes as a woman or as a person of color or whatever, or as a person living with a disability, now let's call to action. And that's when you start getting into leveraging the different types of privilege that people walking the earth have and opening doors for someone who may not have that accessibility, and that gets to equity.
So I know I said I was going to get to engagement, but I want to dig in this a little bit further, because inclusion, at least to me, and I'm hearing you speak on this, all of you have mentioned the power of the story. I feel it's a little abstract. I almost feel like, what do you do if you don't have stories yourself? Like, it almost seems like an insurmountable hurdle without the power of story to let someone know what inclusion, or the lack thereof, exclusion, feels like.
You know, I think that's a very important question to ask, because one of the things you have to remember is that this is not one pathway. There are many pathways. Storytelling is just one aspect of it. And it's not always embracing the story, but stories are culturally sound. Many cultures use stories to document history and to tell about the past and predict the future and talk about the present. So in some cultures, storytelling is essential part of how they exist and how they thrive in their society. But the idea of you not having a story, it may mean that you just haven't thought about it in that way, and that you haven't yet crafted it in that way, but you have experience. That's why the other part about it is so important. Both Janine and Lisa have lifted up. It's not just the story, it's the experience.
It's the
To talk about. It's not just capturing something, and there's some people that are great storytellers. I mean, people make livings off of telling stories, but not everybody is that, skilled at it. And it's not the expectation of living into who you are and existence. That's not the standard, but it's just one way that helps people connect and pay for valuable lessons.
And I love that too, Elizabeth, and I'm going to piggyback off of that as well, because you're right, not everyone does have stories. And to your question, Rashad, so what if you can't think of a story, but you still want to make sure that really inclusive? Well, we all can dial up our empathy. We all can ask questions, so by asking questions and really seeking to understand. Right. So, and I can't remember who said this, but it's like, seek first to understand, not so much to be understood. But when we employ that and say, okay, this is very different to me. I don't know. So I want to ask questions so I can improve my own knowledge around this area. So by asking questions and then suspending judgment. And that is probably harder to do than what it sounds, to suspend judgment, because our society, we're heralded to making quick decisions. Like one of the leadership competencies is really quick decision making, right? So to suspend judgment is almost attention, with that. But if we can go in and suspend judgment, ask questions to understand, and again, deploying that empathy, that will go a long way if we don't have those stories to tell. So some other tips or tools to help create that more inclusive environment, to create that engagement, I think that we're all looking to increase in our organizations.
Yeah, that's powerful. Dialing up the empathy.
Yeah, and that's a strategic principle, what Elizabeth and Lisa are saying. When you want it, these are takeaways, right? What we're talking about now. What are the strategies that you can use today to bring about a culture change? Elizabeth talked about ethnic cultures having oral traditions. Well, work cultures have oral traditions too. It's a culture, it's a way of doing things, and it has a time frame around it. This is how it's always been done, right? And so there are experiences and there are stories that are inbred within your company. It doesn't matter how large it is. It could be 2 people, it could be thousands. Leveraging the opportunity to share those experiences and validate them without judgment. That's called creating a safe space. And as a strategy principle, it's called a courageous conversation. Right? Where because another dimension that we haven't touched on is generations. Every generation has a different experience, how they're approaching work. You got multi-generations in one room trying to work on a team project together. Everybody's going to look at that differently, and every person's experience is valuable. So when you have a space where we could talk about, without suspend judgment for a minute, I understand, I'm talking to my manager. Here's an example. My manager grew up in the 1940s, still working in the space. The 1940s experience, growing, being a teenager in the late 50s, early 60s, during civil rights movement, regardless of their ethnic composition, they have an experience I did not have. That experience formed their work ethic, how they function, how they orient themselves in the world. And now they're talking to me, and I grew up during a period of hip hop and and the dawn of, pre-internet. So I remember when the only form of video gaming was an Atari and ping pong. My kids don't know what a rotary phone looks like, nor could they use one. And so you have all of these experiences that are forming a perspective, and it has a way of identifying how you do work, how you approach work. Mm-hmm. But if we don't have a place as a strategy to have all of those people feel valued when we're approaching a problem as a team, we can't have a courageous conversation where we stop for a minute, suspend judgment, and say, what do you think and how are you feeling?
Yeah.
So Janine, and thank you for that. You brought me to the next phase, which is exactly that, which is, what is our game plan? What is our strategy? What do we actually start doing? How do we get people engaged? So NJBIA, vast majority of the businesses are small businesses, under 100 employees. They may not have the resources to do full-fledged programs, or they may not even have full-fledged HR departments, and it's just kind of divvied up among some folks. So, where should they get started? Is it an exercise of courageous conversations? Is it, what does it look like? How does the rubber start hitting the road?
One of the things I often say, you never know how much your past will affect your future until it shows up in your present. And so in thinking about what Janine just said and how all of that comes together when you want to make efforts or take steps towards the right direction. And I think that one of the things we have to really do is be clear about what we mean. We have to name it. We have to really be clear about what it is we're trying to grapple with and assess, take inventory, really understand what it is we are needing to address and what we want to talk about. This idea of building that bridge of empathy. It's important to understand that empathy is not sympathy. It's not feeling sorry for, it's not feeling guilty about, it's not trying to save, it's a deeper understanding. And it's an opportunity to learn, and you come to a space as mutual learners. There has to be a mindset or an organizational understanding or philosophy around what it means to do the work. What are people understanding? What perspectives are they bringing to the table about what this really means? Because if people we know are starting on different spaces on the spectrum of understanding, we have to bring some common ground into play. And so the first step is to explore what is that common ground, because we get to that by understanding our differences and finding the intersections. And I think that's really an important first step to do.
So Elizabeth, is that at a leadership level? Is it at like a company-wide conversation? Level. Okay.
It's the entire organization has
like
to
all hands type of meeting.
Absolutely, because you can't implement full diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies with just the leadership. Everybody at all levels have to have the same understanding of where you're trying to go and they must participate.
You know what, and so if I can add to just what Elizabeth said too, you're right. So it has to happen at all levels. I think the mistake that we sometimes make is that we think, well, this is HR's responsibility, so I'm just going to leave it to HR to take care of it. And go ahead, HR, do what you need to do. But it's a larger culture change initiative when I think about it. So it's not just putting a Band-Aid on something, right? It's really taking a look holistically on how organizations do business. And so I often stop and think, especially for smaller organizations, like, okay, we don't have the resources to be able to do something full blown. But what you can do, you can stop and look at your organization and say, well, this is where we are. It's almost like doing a gap analysis. This is where we are. This is where we need to be. Now, what's that gap, right? And start looking at that gap. And then I'll also put it in some additional terms too, for those, perhaps they're in marketing, but doing a SWOT analysis on your organization when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, what are our strengths? Looking around the organization and say, what are our strengths? So perhaps we do have a really strong multicultural organization.
So Lisa, real quick, this SWOT analysis though, is it organization wide? Like the whole organization is doing this, or is this the leaders or some group?
I would start with the leaders. No, I would start with the leaders because they have a different perspective. So they can take a look at bird's eye view of their organization and say, here are our strengths. here are the weaknesses as we see them. Here are those opportunities, external opportunities, and here are the threats. So doing that as it pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then you start to see, okay, you know what? Here are some areas that we need to shore up right away, or we're missing some opportunities because we're leaving money on the table. And then when I think about it too, what you also want to start looking at is, having those courageous conversations, because especially starting with your leadership team, because then that's going to be the cascade. So start having those courageous conversations. And these are these tend to make people uncomfortable. And I say you need to sit with being uncomfortable, because that's the only way you're going to move forward. So sit there and be uncomfortable and say, okay, now what can we do with this? So it's doing that kind of having those kinds of conversations. But I will also say too, when I've seen organizations really take on diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially smaller organizations, where it has been most powerful, it has been at the grassroots level. It has been with individual colleagues, individual contributors, and saying, you know what, I want to participate and I want to make a difference with this. So when you have grassroots meeting leadership, well, you have a powerful combination, because what happens then is that you have people who are not just doing it to comply because, the organization says we need to do this. You have people that are committed. And when you have committed people in the organization, that's when you have an explosion. That's when the real magic happens. So top down, yes, leadership, but also bottom up. So, and have those conversations. The thing about this too, people tend to think, well, I don't have the financial funds to do this. This doesn't have to cost you a lot of money, if at all. These are you start opening and having those conversations. And I promise you, you will be amazed at what comes out when people start to see that you care.
Agreed. As I'm listening to what the audience that we have gathered today, the small business owners, right? It's about, as an approach, Lisa and Elizabeth have given you a couple of tools that I was just writing down, right? From the leadership perspective, so first of all, is one of the takeaways today is work culture change happens at all levels of engagement. From the leadership perspective, what leaders in an organization do is they provide direction, and they also hold the purse strings. So having advocates in leadership, or D&I champions in leadership, is important, especially when it's the head. Because if the head of the organization says this is the direction where we're going, then everybody else is going to follow because they're in a position of authority. And so that's an important part of your success. At the same time, think of this culture change as 1,000 points of light and not just one. You have 1,000 points of light, even if you don't have 1,000 people. One person can be multiple points. But the idea is that D&I and culture change is owned by everybody in the organization. How do you do that? Leaders are able to provide core commitments. They're able to define the work culture and say, here's the things that we value at XY organization. And DEI is one of them, and define that for themselves. With that as a SMART goal, meaning it's specific, it's measurable, whatever the other two are, and on a time frame. Okay, so I didn't look that up, but I just remembered. When you're talking about a core commitment, there are specific parameters around versus we want people to just feel valued, but how do we want them to feel? You put that in your core commitment, and then that becomes the foundation from which, from a policy perspective, from a procedural perspective, day to day, from an operations perspective, how people are approaching the commitment. Then you have this engagement opportunity where you start having conversations to build the meat. That's the skeleton. Leadership can provide a skeleton. Building meat comes from the grassroots part. That comes from the employees. And when you have employees that are speaking to what they're experiencing on the day-to-day, that passion is what's going to create what Lisa and Elizabeth said. You have this top-down skeleton approach. The grassroots, the employees are going to put the meat on it. They're going to put the passion behind it. They're going to make sure that we don't stop talking now that things are starting to change. And that doesn't have a price tag. Conversations don't cost anything except time.
So that's, and this top down kind of from the bottom up, the community, in many ways, it's a provocative question too, because it gets back to, the conversations that we have about boards and leadership in general. And if it is top down and we're talking about inclusion and the top looks very uniform or not like what the rest of the company looks like or what we would want the rest of the company to look like, it really asks a lot of questions about where do we get started and who owns accountability for this? Because ultimately, in the setup to this talk, we had talked about this. Who owns accountability? Does it have to be the CEO or the board of directors? Or is it, Elizabeth, I know you had mentioned, ultimately everyone has to own this.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But is there, if you're going to move the organization, you got to get buy-in from the leadership. Otherwise, it's going to be very hard to have a movement because these are, most businesses are not democracies.
Yeah, one of the things that's important to understand, Accenture did some research around organizational cultures and how the perceptions of the leaders are quite different from their employees, particularly when it comes to cultural inclusion. And so whereas the employer often said, oh yeah, we're inclusive, we listen to everyone, everybody contributes, and we think that we're an inclusive organization, the gap was at least 30% every time between their perception and employees' perception. So the vantage point of a founder of a business or a executive leader of a business, because they are not always directly linked to every aspect of the business, they can have a very different perspective because those around them are behaving the way that they anticipate or expect, because they've developed that commonality and understanding, and no one else has it in an organization. So we have to be real. There absolutely could be a perception gap in understanding whether or not inclusion really exists. And so if that is true, how can you depend on their insights solely first when there are other things that are happening? That's why it's so important to think about this happening simultaneously and throughout the organization, because those kinds of perception gaps exist. And we know that perception is reality. And sometimes to hear the reality is shocking to leadership. They go into denial, then it's not worth it, it's not worth the time and energy, they're complainers, there are all kinds of things to excuse what people's perceptions are based on their real life experiences in the company. But we have to take that in consideration. So people need to be courageous enough and brave enough to hear that there are multiple truths.
I like that a lot. And as a tool in terms of, again, a takeaway that can be leveraged today is an employee engagement survey. You name it and use a Survey Monkey, which is web-based. You can get that account today for free. And you set it up, and you send it out as an email, but constructing the questions needs to be strategic. But what it does is it creates a data point for a senior leader then to say, here's what your employees are saying. It's anonymous, so you don't have a particular person, right, looking at it, but here's what the employees are saying about the inclusivity in the workplace. Do you see it the same way? No? Then here's where we need to start focus, because if people are not feeling the way you feel, we have an opportunity to improve. And the reason that you want to improve senior leader is because there is profitability attached to this. And that's where we go back to the business case, right? So we're not approaching senior leadership from the standpoint of this is the right thing to do. No, this is a business imperative, because if we don't address these issues, people are going to start leaving. Retention rates are going to fly through the roof. And as a result, it costs more money for healthcare for a new employee to leave in under 12 months than it does to continue to be, not only healthcare, but to train them, bring them up to speed. It takes 5 years for you to get the return on investment. And what we're finding is that employees are joining organizations and leaving in 2 to 3.
So yeah, Janine, what you've done is you've helped us now see what, if you don't get inclusion right, these are some of the costs.
These are the costs. And small businesses can't afford, we can't afford this. We simply cannot afford this. We have to keep the talent after we've spent the dollars to recruit them. We have to keep them.
You do, and I want to add to that too, because the other thing, and back to your question, Rashad, to you asked who's ultimately accountable. Well, the senior leadership team is ultimately accountable because we have to have accountability somewhere, right? We can't diffuse it. The accountability sits on the shoulders of the CEO, and as well as that person's senior leadership team, as well as the board of directors, because that is their role to guide the company to be forward looking. So in that instance, if you're looking at, okay, if we have diffused accountability, and we all know what happens when we have that, nothing gets done or there's finger pointing. But when you have one person or one group or one entity saying, okay, I'm accountable for this, then you know what to do to go back to it. And, and I've seen, and I think, a number of folks have seen it as well, probably in the audience, but it's, the CEO Diversity Pledge, right? And you can go to that website and you can see all the organizations that have taken this diversity pledge about how they're going to support diversity within their organizations in a whole litmus test. So this began back in 2017, right after the Charlottesville incident. So great. So, and I think it was Tim Rice from PwC who started this whole thing. And he said, you know what, this is appalling. As business leaders, we need to do something. So hence, he created the CEO Diversity Pledge. Well, that started then. And now fast forward almost 4 years, it has over 1,700 or 1,800 organizations that have taken this pledge. So you're saying, okay, great, wow, interesting. Yeah, and I do applaud them. However, the however piece is, what are the organizations actually doing? Have they just taken this pledge? Some, yes, but then you can go into an actions tab on that website, and then you can see companies and some of the real actions they've taken around diversity, equity, inclusion. Now, some of them are just on this journey. So I applaud them. There are others who have been at it for a while and they're transparent. They're like, you know what? We haven't done, as much as we should, or we didn't meet the expectations we set for ourselves. And here's what we're doing. But you really get to see what companies are doing. The reason why this is important is because now you have a number of folks who are saying, I want to work in an organization that, that really takes diversity seriously. So how do I find that out? Well, you go to a company's website, everyone's going to have that banner. Yes, we applaud diversity, equity, inclusion, we stand behind it, et cetera, right? Everyone's going to say that. But now when you really want to know what companies are doing, go to that CEO Diversity Pledge website, and you get to see the actions, and you get to see how transparent they are. That's important because as people start to look for different job opportunities, as our economy starts to get better, they're going to go to companies where they know that they can feel valued. So organizations would, it's in their best interest to start to say, okay, we need to take this seriously because of the business case behind it. And because, as Janine said too, we also have 5 generations in the workplace. So never before have we had 5 generations in the workplace. As of about 2 years ago, we started having Gen Zs who are graduating high school coming into the workplace. So we've had 4 for a while, but now we have 5. And what are those differences? What are the things that if I'm a Gen Z, I'm a 19-year-old and I'm working, what do I value? And versus perhaps that person who's on the silent generation, that's in their, like maybe there's mid to early 70s, that's still working. So again, we talk about diversity of experiences, we talk about diversity of thought and diversity in our values. So again, these are all the reasons why it's in our best interest to start thinking about this. And start thinking about it and looking at it instead of like, oh, wow, this is an issue or could be a challenge, but reframe it and say, this is a huge opportunity for us. 5 generations, think about the knowledge base. Think about the institutional knowledge that person who is still working, that's of the silent generation or baby boomers. Think about the institutional knowledge that they have, right? And then think about the technology prowess that a Gen Z or millennials bring to the table. So, wow, when you bring those 2 together, you have a recipe for incredible success and legacy in your organization to move forward. So again, it's about reframing how we think about things. And that's a dimension of diversity too, diversity of thought. So I've just said a whole lot there.
Hi, Janine.
I like the thoughts that Lisa shared with everyone. I'm thinking about tools that the small business owner, which is our audience today, can take and leverage today. And one of the ways in which you can capitalize on some of that institutional knowledge and intrigue the Gen Z generation at the same time is thinking about an employee resource group. If you don't have one already built, think about building those. And what those are essentially communities. And it also builds off the concept of a psychologically safe workplace. It's a community that encourages employees that share something in common to come together during the workday. So again, we talked about the fact that in launching a comprehensive diversity strategy doesn't have to cost you money, but there's only two types of currency, right? Money or time. Mm-hmm. And so some of the strategies that you can implement today could cost you time. Time for employees who share similar backgrounds and interests to come together during the workday to celebrate what they have in common, but also to leverage that as a voice for the overall workforce when leadership wants buy-in. And it can be a very powerful employee engagement tool to say, listen, we want to hear from the generations that are within the workforce. And rather than having one for your more seasoned employees and one for your Gen Zs, think about having one for all generations. So this is for people who are passionate about the generation that they grew up. And you could create some courageous conversations around why, it is so awesome to be 19. And why is it so awesome to be 70? If you have that kind of diversity in it, where we come together and we listen to one another during the workday, unheard of, innovation.
That's great. No,
yeah, can I just add one thing to this?
Sure. And before you do, Elizabeth, I just want to let everyone else know we're going to be ready for Q&A soon. So I'm going to let Elizabeth finish on this comment, but then please feel free to put questions either in the chat or unmute yourself and ask them directly. So Elizabeth, please. Thank you.
One of the things I think is very important to understand that as a business, no matter what size you are, whether you're less than 100 or more than 2,000, the idea of thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion as an asset and not a liability is important. Mm-hmm. It's not just about the cost, it's about the savings.
Yes.
You save money and a whole lot
of money
when you don't have to deal with the dilemmas of people being treated unfairly.
Yes.
Having costs around people having to go to HR all the time and having complaints and dealing with the litigations and things that arise. Because if people are in psychologically safe spaces, they're courageous and brave enough to hold space for these kinds of conversations, they can deal with things on their own. Yeah. It doesn't get
Oh, I think we may have lost Elizabeth. Well, that is the Zoom world we're in. But on Elizabeth's point, I mean, take a look at what's going on in Georgia right now. There's a very important consequence to the voice that
and it's an asset and not a liability.
Oh, there we go. Perfect.
There we go.
You're back.
Okay. With that being said, I know we're a little bit behind, but if anyone does have questions, I have a whole bunch of more questions, so don't give me too much time. But I want to allow others to have their voice heard as well. So if you do have questions, please unmute yourself and feel free to share it with the panel. Don't be shy. We'll keep it going.
I hope no one's thinking, oh, you're preaching to the choir. Because I often say choirs need rehearsal.
Yeah, you did say that.
So this is your rehearsal time. Let's get it right. Let's put it out there.
So that's a good point. And Elizabeth, I remember you mentioning at a previous point, this takes bravery.
It does.
Right? So talk about that. Talk about bravery versus kind of the other attitudes we might have towards this.
Yeah, it does. It takes bravery. And I think the understanding is that bravery doesn't happen without fear. The fear factor.
Say that again. Say that again.
Bravery doesn't happen without fear. And so we have to understand in doing this work and given the climate in which we live in, we have to understand that there's something much more important than our fear at stake. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism work is high stakes. It's not a numbers game. It's about quality of life, quality of experience. It's about the things that we have that are, quality standards and practices and attitudes and behaviors and policies and practices that work for everyone, where all types of people can thrive and succeed. Early in my career, when I worked for a social justice nonprofit, we were ambitious in thinking that, we were going to make America a better place for all of us, not just some of us. And so inclusion means that your workspace is a better place for all of us and not just some of us. So I think that bravery is overcoming the fear and conquering that fear. And people often don't engage because they're too afraid of making mistakes and not being perfect and other things. But we have to know that we've been socialized to believe that there is a standard of perfection that oftentimes doesn't include people of color. It doesn't include those who have been marginalized or minoritized. And so some of those supremacy norms don't work in our favor. So there's a lot of unlearning. It takes bravery to unlearn and then commit to the learning. So I think when we talk about bravery, it's a combination of that understanding and those things.
And Elizabeth, I just want to dovetail on what you just said too, because that's so true. Oftentimes it is that bravery, and as somebody put in the chat, the definition of fear, false evidence appearing real, and I love that. But the other thing is that just again, we have to say something. We have to have those conversations. And we're fearful of saying the wrong thing. We're fearful of making a mistake. It's oftentimes when somebody has a death in the family and we don't say anything to them because we're fearful of saying the wrong thing. But that's actually worse because, it's that silence, and that silence almost feels like you're complicit. So have those courageous conversations, get over the fear. We have that self-editing voice in the back of our head saying, oh, you don't want to say that. You don't want to open up those can of worms. You don't want to go there. But I'm saying to you, yes, go there, ask those questions. And again, as the intent that you're having, assume good intent, but also if you're like, well, this is not an area I'm comfortable in, I would just say that this is an area I'm not comfortable in. I might make some mistakes in what I'm saying, but my heart is in the right place and I want to learn. So please help me, and go into it with that.
So we have a question here in the chat from Maya Curry, and it is Chambers of Commerce. If you're interested in bringing these conversations and creating programming, how do you encourage more diverse participation? They've been doing this, but it seems like they're preaching to the choir. It's the same people who are showing up. This is getting back to bravery and fear, perhaps, or how do we get other people who are not normally in these discussions to start participating in these discussions?
Can I take a stab at that?
Please.
I'm gonna say something provocative, and that is when we talk about creating a workplace that's inclusive or works for all, that includes the white male. I'm just let y'all sit with that for a minute, because oftentimes when we talk about diversity, we don't include the white male. And yet when we're talking about small businesses and the majority of the type of work that is actually going to change the experience of marginalized or minoritized communities, as Elizabeth said, we can't do that without the white male and the diversity within that experience. There's an organization called MARC, Men Advocating for Real Change. And one of the things that I'm finding in the work that I'm doing in the environment that I'm in, and I told you, I explained that, it's 80% white male and 75% union, and there's a whole cultural perspective around that. But one of the things that I'm finding that's embedded in the personal stories is how white men who have children of color feel when racism attacks their kid. And the conversation that comes up is, I can't extend my white privilege to my son, who walks on the earth male and Black, and I can't protect him when I'm not with him. I think part of the challenge of addressing fear is assuming that individuals who are in the dominant seats, whether it be in leadership or education or the marketplace don't want to have a courageous conversation with you. I think that's erroneous. There are some, and those are powerful allies to engage. So to the question about the Chamber of Commerce, perhaps this is an opportunity to look at how do you engage more of your white constituents in conversations around diversity. And the only way you're going to do that is to ask them what they want to know, as opposed to assuming that we already do.
Yeah, and you
That's
bring up a
important.
point.
So Janine, look at the follow-up conversation though. They're not coming. They're not.
But has anybody asked them? Has anybody invited them to dance?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look at the room right now.
Right. Oh, I see.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, has anyone specifically invited a predominantly white organization or an organization, it's not predominantly white, but an organization who's led by a white leader, male in particular? Would you like to participate in this diversity discussion? And if so, what would you like to hear? What would you like to know?
And I think this conversation is so important because, again, the allyship, concept, and we could spend like another hour talking about allyship. But because white men still sit at the seat of power, in this world, we also need to pull them in so they can help become allies. And oftentimes they don't know how, or there's a fear that, okay, power is being stripped from me. So I think white men are dealing with a couple of things about the world is changing so fast. Yes, I'm still in the seat of power, but I see things that are happening and there's so much rumbling underneath my feet. So to that point is, we do need to ask them, because I think sometimes we'd be very surprised that they would say, yes, I've been wanting to do this, but I didn't know how to approach it.
But maybe not in the way we're asking them now, because
right
now it's an open invite and they're not coming.
Right. So again, going back to that, I think that personal story piece is like going to them and saying, and having that personal story, because what happens oftentimes is people will tend to dismiss or discount the experience that other people are having because they don't have it. So I might discount or dismiss if you tell me something is so difficult and so hard, right? And I can't relate to it. But if you tell me that I've experienced this, but because I'm a white male, like I have no idea what she's talking about. Like, is she over dramatizing something? So again, the ability to have empathy is one thing. The other thing is pulling folks in, because when it's all said and done too, at the end of the day, when we all close our eyes for good, there is a legacy we want to have said about us. There is a legacy we want to leave. And if that legacy, is helping make a difference in this world, that's one of the ways that people can do this.
So does this mean we have to personally invite and pull them in, speak to them individually? Because the default email coming through their inbox, it's not catching their attention. I'm sorry.
So can we talk about communication styles for a second?
So we have 1 minute left. I'm going to give you guys 30 seconds each. 30 seconds each. I apologize. But Elizabeth, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, one of the things I just want to say is that we want to be careful that we don't buy into the privilege of white folks not having to engage.
Right.
It is a privilege for white folks to not have to have these kinds of conversations when people of color and people on the receiving end of oppression are having them all the time, and they're living these experiences. I want to be careful about how we are having to beg people to come into and take care of another human being. There has to be some willingness for folks to do this. And I think that organizations have to put in place standards and expectations. Yes. So if you are a CEO and a white male in this organization, there's an expectation that you get engaged, that you participate. If you're a membership organization, then your core values need to articulate that white males and people of color have to be in this together. There has to be some standards and practices that are set in place and expectations. Because if you make that statement as a core value of your membership and engagement, then people understand if I'm going to be on board, This is what I have to do. So this is about setting new standards of behaviors and attitudes and practices versus trying to force people into. But there's a way that you want to do business, and you got to let people know that. And everybody's a part of it, because I don't want to get people who are being oppressed feeling like, here I go again having to teach someone else. But there has to be a commitment to unlearning. You got to unlearn that privilege and learn that there's something else you need to do to
So I'm going to apologize to Lisa and Janine because we're out of time. Unfortunately, that was fantastic though, Elizabeth. So thank you to our panelists, Lisa, Janine, and Elizabeth. And of course, a big thank you to all of you out there for attending the panel. They're going to drop a link in the chat for the next panel, which is on demand. So feel free to watch it now or whenever it's convenient. Otherwise, I'm Rashad Bajwa with Domain Technology Partners, and that was an amazing conversation that we need to have more of. Thank you, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
You guys are great.
Love that, Rashad. And that's it. That was more than just it. Thank you so much. That was extremely powerful, and we really appreciate. And folks were so tuned in the chat, really engaging, very action oriented. Today, I have to say, today has really been so much nuts and bolts. We have so many people joining us today who are at the beginning of their journey, and they were hungry. They were hungry for information on the how, and you all really brought it on today. So I want to thank you for your active participation, extraordinary panel, and thanks again.